There are marriages made for love and marriages made for other reasons, and the world has always found the second kind easier to arrange. The marriage of Miss Cecily Vane to Edmund Ashby, Duke of Ashenmere, was arranged in the drawing-room of her father's house in the 3rd week of October, between two men who had known one another for 20 years, and who had, in the course of those 20 years, made several arrangements that had suited them both well. The arrangement suited them both now. It suited Sir Richard Vane, who had a daughter of 23 that polite society had quietly decided was too composed, too serious and too well-read to be charming in the expected way. It suited the Duke, who had an estate of 20,000 acres in Wiltshire, a title, an obligation to produce an heir, and no particular interest in the long social season required to find one by the conventional method. It did not, at the time of the arrangement, seem necessary to ask Cecily what suited her. Cecily had been present at the edge of the drawing-room conversation, in the chair near the window that she always chose because it gave the best light for reading, and because it placed her at the exact angle least visible to anyone entering from the door. She had heard the arrangement being made. She had watched her father's face become gradually more satisfied, and the Duke's face remain exactly as it had been when he came in, which was to say controlled, correct, and impossible to read. She had set down her book very quietly on the side table beside the chair, and she had folded her hands in her lap, and she had looked out at the October garden, which was the colour of rust and bone, and she had made, in the privacy of her own mind, a single clear decision. She would not make a scene. She would not weep. She would not plead for romance she had not been offered and was not going to receive. She would go to Ashenmere Hall as the Duke's wife, and she would be the most capable and self-possessed wife the house had ever had, and she would not, under any circumstances, allow anyone in it to make her ashamed of having been chosen for practical reasons rather than tender ones. She was, as it happened, rather good at decisions of this kind. The wedding was quiet, the following month, in the village church nearest Sir Richard's house. The November morning was cold and clear, the sort of cold that has no sentimentality in it. The Duke came to the church on time and in good order, in dark morning dress and a pale waistcoat, and he made his responses in a voice that was steady and quiet, and gave away nothing. Cecily made hers in a voice that was steady and quiet, and gave away nothing. The vicar, who had known Cecily since she was 7, looked at her once at the close of the ceremony with an expression of mild concerned bewilderment, and she returned it with a small composed smile that said, as clearly as a smile can say anything, that she was perfectly well, and that he need not worry, and that the congregation might now proceed to the cold collation in the church hall. The Duke handed her into the carriage with the correct formality. They drove to Ashenmere Hall in polite, largely silent companionship for a distance of 30 miles. He asked whether she was warm enough. She said she was. He asked whether she found the country roads tolerable. She said she did. He looked out of the window for the remainder of the journey. She looked out of hers. The silence was not unkind. It was simply the silence of two people who had not yet decided what to say to one another. Ashenmere Hall stood at the end of an avenue of old lime trees that had lost their leaves entirely, so that the approach to the house was a long tunnel of pale bare branches against a grey November sky. The house itself was stone, large, grey, Georgian, with 3 rows of tall sash windows, and the slightly withdrawn quality of a house that had been well maintained but not much loved for some years. A small staff was assembled on the front steps to receive them. The housekeeper, a composed woman of 50 called Mrs. Farron, came forward first, curtsied to the Duke, and then turned to Cecily with the careful, neutral, professional expression of a woman who was reserving judgment. Cecily looked at the house. She looked at the blank pale windows and the careful gravel sweep and the 2 ornamental urns on the upper balustrade, which had been planted with something that had since died. She looked at the lime tree avenue behind her, grey and bare. She looked at the small assembled staff, their faces ranging from correctly welcoming to mildly apprehensive. She took a breath of cold November air. Then she walked up the front steps at the Duke's side, with her chin level and her hands quiet, and her face arranged in the composed expression she had been perfecting since she was old enough to understand that she was never going to be the kind of woman whose face arranged itself for her. She was here, she would learn the house. The house was cold in ways that went beyond the November temperature. The dining room table was set on the first evening, for two, with a width of dark mahogany and 4 empty chairs between them. The candelabra at each end gave a correct and slightly theatrical light. The Duke poured wine and made careful conversation about the estate's approach roads and the condition of the lime trees, and a drainage matter on the north field that he had been meaning to address before winter. Cecily listened, asked 1 or 2 precise questions, and was pleased to see twice a brief pause in the Duke's responses that suggested he had not expected the questions to be precise. She ate the roast pheasant and the apricot pudding without complaint and thanked Mrs. Farren, whom she had privately asked to present the household accounts to her in the morning. "You wish to see the accounts," the Duke said when Mrs. Farren had withdrawn. "I should like to understand the household, Your Grace," said Cecily. "I cannot manage what I do not understand. Mrs. Farren manages the household. Mrs. Farren manages it very well, I am sure. I should like, however, to understand it myself. I find that the people who run a household are always more willing to speak honestly to someone who has first taken the trouble to read the ledgers." The Duke looked at her from the far end of the table briefly, with the particular look of a man who has been given an answer he had not anticipated. "Of course," he said, "Mrs. Farren will provide whatever you require. Thank you, Your Grace." She poured her own second glass of wine because it was slightly closer to her end of the table and the footman was still in the corridor. She did this without self-consciousness because she did not, in general, waste energy on self-consciousness when wine was available. The Duke watched her do it. She did not notice him watching. In the first 2 weeks at Ashenmere, Cecily did what she had promised herself she would do. She learned the house. She walked every floor, every corridor, every garden path she could find that was not entirely under water from the November rains. She sat with Mrs. Farren for 2 hours the morning after her arrival, and went through the household accounts with the attention of a woman who had been helping her widowed father manage a small estate in Yorkshire since she was 17. She learned the names of the 31 people who made up the household staff at Ashenmere, their names, their years of service, their particular roles. She sat in the servants' hall once on the 3rd day when the cook was explaining a difficulty with the range, and listened to the explanation carefully, and then asked 3 practical questions that had not previously been asked and which resulted in a solution by the following morning. The cook told the head housemaid that evening that the new Duchess was, in point of fact, not what she had expected. The head housemaid reserved judgment. The head housemaid had been at Ashenmere for 11 years and had learned in those 11 years that reserved judgment was generally the safer position. The Duke, during those first 2 weeks, was correct and distant. He was in the library most mornings, working through the estate's correspondence with his secretary, Mr. Finch. He rode out every afternoon, in whatever weather the afternoon offered, which in November in Wiltshire was generally some variation on grey and wet. He dined with Cecily every evening, and the dining-room conversation improved, gradually in specificity if not in warmth, as Cecily worked through the facts of the estate and the Duke, who had perhaps not in recent years had anyone at his table who wished to discuss the facts of the estate, found himself, against some internal resistance, answering honestly. He did not come to her rooms. She had not expected him to, and she did not speak of it. They were not yet that kind of marriage. She was practical enough to know that such marriages required time to become that kind, and principled enough to know that time, in such a case, could not be hurried from her end without becoming something she refused to let it become. She was, however, aware of the locked door. It was at the end of the east corridor on the 1st floor, past the portrait gallery and the small room that had been, at some point in the past, a day nursery, and past a linen cupboard, and past a storage room. The door was of dark oak, the same as the other doors on the corridor, but it had a different quality of closeness than the others. The others were simply closed. This one was locked, and the lock was newer than the door, and there was, in the small clearing of dust and footprint around it, the suggestion of a door that was approached from time to time and then departed from without being opened. Cecily noticed it on her second day in the course of her general survey of the house. She did not remark on it. She noted it in the private ledger of things she had noticed and intended to understand, and she walked on. She asked Mrs. Farren about it on the 5th day, when they had reached a comfortable enough working understanding that Mrs. Farren was likely to answer honestly. Mrs. Farren answered carefully. She said the room had been locked for some years and that the key was in his Grace's keeping, and that she could not in conscience say more than that, but that she could say that it was not a room that had been locked for any bad reason, and that Cecily should not worry herself about it. Cecily thanked her and did not ask again. She did, however, begin to pay close attention to the portrait gallery. The portrait gallery at Ashenmere ran the length of the south wall of the first floor, perhaps 60 feet, with a long series of family portraits in gilt frames going back 4 or 5 generations. Most of the portraits were conventional. There was a third duke in a powdered wig, and a fourth duchess in a blue silk gown, and various younger sons and daughters and cousins in the usual poses. There was a portrait of the present duke at perhaps 20, painted in the style of the early part of the century, quite good, with the same controlled face and the same watchful eyes he still had, but without the faint quality of closed-off that had settled around them in the intervening years. There was on the south wall, halfway along, a gap. The gap was the width and height of a large portrait. The hook was still in the wall. The space of slightly less faded wallpaper where the frame had hung was still visible. The gap was between the portrait of the third Duchess and a small landscape of the Ashenmere Park in summer. Cecily stood in front of the gap for some time on the afternoon of the 9th day. She did not say anything about the gap. She went back to the library, where the household's older account books were kept in the lower shelves, and she spent the remainder of the afternoon reading the account books for the years 12 and 13 years before. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. She found what she was looking for in the book for the year 11 years before, in the late spring entries. A small series of payments to a London firm of solicitors under a heading that had been recorded, in a different hand from the surrounding entries, as miscellaneous family affairs. The payments were not large, but they were frequent and regular through that spring, and then they stopped entirely in the early summer. In the early summer of that same year, in the household accounts, was a different kind of entry. A single payment to a house agent in Dorset for the provision and preparation of a rented property, described only as for the use of a member of the household, duration unspecified. The entry was in the same different hand. No further mention of the Dorset property appeared in any subsequent account book. Cecily sat with the account books for a long time in the quiet library. Rain moved against the windows. A log shifted in the fireplace. Outside, somewhere on the drive, she could hear the distant sound of the Duke returning from his afternoon ride, the horse's hooves on wet gravel. She closed the account book. She put it back in its place on the lower shelf. She sat at the desk and folded her hands on its surface and thought, with the careful, deliberate attention she gave to all important things, about what she now knew, what she did not know, and what of those two categories was her business to ask about. She decided after some time that the gap in the portrait gallery and the payments to the London solicitors were not, by themselves, any of her business. She had found them in the estate accounts, and they were part of the estate she now managed, but the people they referred to were not yet her people, and the history they contained was not yet her history. The locked room was a different matter. The locked room was in her house. She was the Duchess of Ashenmere. There was a room in her house that she could not enter, and she was a woman who did not live comfortably in houses with rooms she could not enter. She decided to speak to the Duke. She spoke to him that evening at the dinner table after the soup and before the fish. "Your Grace, Your Grace." It was the usual way they addressed one another in those first weeks, and neither of them had yet suggested anything different. "I should like to speak to you about the locked room at the end of the east corridor. I do not ask from idle curiosity. I ask because I am attempting to understand the house I now manage, and because I have now passed that door a number of times and have found it weighing on my mind. I have spoken to Mrs. Farron, who told me only that the key is in your keeping, and that there was no bad reason for the lock. I am prepared to accept that. I should like only to ask directly whether the room is something you intend to address eventually, or whether it is something you intend to keep closed for the length of hour for an extended period. The Duke set down his fork. He looked at her from the far end of the table for several seconds. It is a room I intend to keep closed for the present, he said. I see. May I ask whether the reason for keeping it closed is one that, in your private judgment, has any bearing on the management of this household or on my own position in it? Another pause. It does not, he said, in any practical sense. Then I shall not ask again, Your Grace. Thank you for answering directly. She picked up her own fork and returned to the soup. The Duke watched her do so. He said then something that was not his usual kind of remark. He said, You are, Miss Vane, Your Grace, not at all what I anticipated. I imagine not, said Cecily. I rarely am. She did not look up from her soup, but she was, for the first time in 3 weeks, very slightly warmer than she had been a moment before. The crisis, when it arrived, was brought in by December. December came to Ashenmere with hard frosts and a letter from a solicitor in Dorset. The letter was addressed to the Duke, forwarded from London, and arrived one morning on the breakfast-room table along with 2 other letters and the morning newspapers. The Duke broke the seal and read it at the table. Cecily was at her end of the table with a cup of tea and a Wiltshire newspaper, and did not, at first, notice the change in the quality of his attention. She noticed it when she lowered the newspaper. The Duke was sitting with the letter in his hand, and his face, which was always controlled, which she had been studying for 3 weeks now and was beginning to read, had gone through a change she had not yet seen. He looked for perhaps 4 seconds like a man who had been expecting a thing for a long time and was not, now that it had arrived, in any way ready. Then he put the letter into his coat pocket and poured more coffee and said nothing about it, and the morning continued. In the afternoon, Cecily found Mrs. Farron in the linen room. Mrs. Farron, she said, will you tell me about the Dorset property? Mrs. Farron set down the stack of folded linen she had been counting. She looked at Cecily for some time. Then she sat, which she had never done in Cecily's presence because a housekeeper did not sit in the Duchess's presence without being asked. She sat on the low linen chest because she needed to sit, and she said, His Grace's younger brother, Your Grace. Mr. Thomas Ashby. He has been in Dorset for 11 years in a small property his family arranged for him, living quietly with a pension from the estate and a condition attached to it. Cecily sat down on the wooden chair by the window. What condition? That he have no contact with the family, that he make no public claim on the estate, that he not communicate the existence of his, Your Grace, there is a child. Mr. Thomas had a child 11 years ago, born outside of marriage, to a woman from the village who died the following spring. The family, His Grace's father, who was then the Duke, arranged the Dorset property and the pension. He arranged also for the child to be placed with respectable people in Dorset, near Mr. Thomas, where Mr. Thomas could see the child but could not formally claim her. The agreement was that this would continue until the child was of age and could determine her own situation. The child is now, Your Grace, she is 11 years old, her name is Margaret. And the letter this morning. I don't know what the letter said, Your Grace. I know Mr. Thomas has been poorly through the autumn. I know it because I have been corresponding privately with the woman who manages the Dorset house for some years. His Grace the present Duke does not know this. His Grace's father required us all 11 years ago to treat the matter as though it did not exist. His Grace the present Duke was 23 at the time. He agreed to the arrangement because his father required it, and because he was 23, and because he did not yet know what agreeing to such things costs. Does he know what it costs now? I think, Your Grace, that he has known for some years. I think he has been paying it quietly every day without doing anything about it, because the arrangement his father made seemed, once made, impossible to revise without causing more harm than it prevented. I think he has been looking for a way to be wrong about that and has not found one. Cecily sat for some time with this. "Mrs. Farron," she said at last, "thank you for telling me. Your Grace, I hope I have not. I hoped you would be the kind of person I could tell." "You were right," said Cecily. "I am." She found the Duke in the library an hour later. He was at his desk, with the letter from Dorset on the surface in front of him and his hands on either side of it, and his gaze fixed on the middle distance in the way of a man who had been sitting in exactly this position for some time without arriving at anything. She came in without knocking, because the door was open, and because she had decided in the linen room that there were no more correct distances to maintain in this matter. She sat in the chair across the desk from him. She did not speak first. He looked at her. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her for 3 weeks, carefully, watchfully, with the controlled attention of a man who is trying to read someone and is not entirely sure he is capable of it. Except that now, beneath the control, there was something else, something that was not quite grief and not quite shame and not quite fear, but had elements of all three. "Mrs. Farron has told you," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes, I intended to tell you myself. I had intended to tell you before we married. I did not. I told myself I would tell you when you were settled here, when the time was correct, when the right moment." He stopped. "There was no right moment. There was only my reluctance to tell you a thing that I believed would alter your view of this house, and of the family you had married into, and of me." "What does the letter say?" He looked at the paper on the desk. "Thomas is worse. He has been ill through November. The letter is from the woman who manages the house. She says he asked in a lucid period last week whether Margaret might be told who her father is if he does not recover. He has not asked this before. He agreed 11 years ago that he would not ask. He is asking now because he is afraid he will not have another opportunity. And the child is 11. Yes, and she does not know. She knows Thomas. She knows him as she has been told he is a connection of the family's, a distant one who takes an interest in her welfare. She visits him weekly. He is, by all accounts, good with her. He stopped. I have not met her. I was advised by the solicitors at the time that contact between myself and that contact would confuse the arrangement. I have not been to Dorset. I have managed the pension. I have ensured the property is maintained. I have done what the papers required, and I have not done what those papers could not require, and I have told myself for 11 years that this was the responsible management of an impossible situation. And this morning I received a letter that has made it significantly harder to continue believing that." He fell silent. Cecily looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at the man across from her, who had been a controlled and distant stranger for 3 weeks and who was now in this cold library in December no longer either. "Your Grace," she said. "Edmund." He looked up. It was the first time she had used his name. "You should go to Dorset," she said. "You should go this week if the roads permit. You should go and see your brother, and you should see the child, and you should tell your brother that his daughter will know who she is, and who her family is before any condition or agreement or arrangement devised by a man 11 years dead can prevent it. And when you return, we will determine together what provision Ashenmere ought properly to make for her, in a manner that does not hide her in a house in Dorset for the rest of her life." He was quiet for some time. "You understand what this will mean," he said. "For the family name, for what people will say." "I understand it perfectly. I also understand that you have a niece who is 11 years old and does not know she has a family, and that there is a room at the end of the east corridor that I strongly suspect contains either her portrait or her mother's or both, and that you have been passing that room every day for 11 years, and that this is not management of an impossible situation. This is a man slowly disappearing behind a locked door of his own making. And I did not come to Ashenmere Hall to watch that continue." He looked at her. He looked at her in a way he had not yet looked at her, not the careful, watchful assessment of the first weeks, something else, something that was, beneath its surprise, a kind of recognition. "You did not," he said, "have to say any of that." "No," said Cecily. "I chose to. There is a difference." He stood. He went to the window. He stood at it for some time with his hands behind his back and his face turned away from her, and she allowed him the time because she had become, in 3 weeks at Ashenmere, fairly skilled at reading when a man needed to be spoken to and when he needed to be left with a long, clear window and a grey December park. When he turned, his face had not changed very much. It was still controlled. It was still the face she had been learning for 3 weeks. But the something beneath the control had shifted. The closed-off quality had moved, not disappeared, but moved, become something more like a door that was not locked so much as very heavy, and that was beginning slightly to open. "Will you come with me," he said, "to Dorset?" She had not expected that, she considered it. "Yes," she said, "if you wish it." "I do." She stood, she did not move toward him. She was not yet the kind of person who moved toward him, and they were not yet the kind of marriage where she could, and she was honest enough with herself about both those facts to remain where she was. But she said, "Then I will arrange for the carriage in the morning, and speak to Mrs. Farren about what the house will need in our absence, and if you should wish to tell me about your brother, or about Margaret, or about any other thing you have been keeping in that room at the end of the East Corridor, I am available to listen. I am not, it should be said, very easy to shock. My father was a practical man, and I have read a great number of books, and between the two of those influences I have a fairly comprehensive understanding of the full range of human circumstances." He looked at her, and for the second time in their acquaintance, the very small, unguarded smile crossed the lower part of his face. "Yes," he said, "I rather suspected you might." They went to Dorset in the 3rd week of December in the large travelling coach, over roads that were cold but passable. The visit lasted 4 days. Cecily did not record most of it, even in her own private writing. Some things belong to the people who were present, and the reunion of a brother with a brother he had not seen in 11 years is not the kind of material that improves by being written about. She sat with Thomas in his small, comfortable parlour on the first afternoon, while Edmund was with Margaret in the garden, and she drank tea and spoke to him quietly about the estate and about Wiltshire and about the household at Ashenmere, and he told her, in the somewhat surprised voice of an ill man who has had very few visitors from the upper branch of his family, that she was not at all what he had imagined his brother would marry. "What had you imagined?" she said. "Someone frightened of him," said Thomas. "He has, when he is not being kind, a very good impression of a man one ought to be frightened of." "Yes," said Cecily. "I noticed that. I was not frightened, I was interested." Thomas smiled. He was a thin man, pale from his illness, with a version of his brother's face that had been softened by 11 years of a quieter life, and the unceremonious company of a child who had, by all available evidence, no interest in being impressed by anything. Margaret came in from the garden at the end of the afternoon and sat at the edge of the settee and looked at Cecily with the sharp, direct, undeceived regard of a child who has grown up in a small household with intelligent adults and has acquired early the ability to take a person's measure. "Are you the Duchess?" she said. "I am," said Cecily. "Uncle Thomas says I am to call you Aunt Cecily." "You may if you like." "I might," said Margaret. "I'll decide." Cecily looked at her. "That seems entirely reasonable," she said. Margaret appeared to consider this an adequate response. She picked up a book from the table and began to read with the comfortable authority of a child who has decided that the adult in question has passed the first examination. Edmund stood in the doorway at the end of the parlour, having just come in from the garden, and he watched his wife and his niece settle into a first cautious companionship with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has just been told reliably that he may set it down. They returned to Ashenmere in the last days of December, with an arrangement in place and a solicitor engaged, and a set of plans being drawn up for Margaret's future that did not involve a small house in Dorset and a fiction. Mrs. Farren received them at the front door with the expression of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this outcome and was choosing not to say so. On the evening of their return, Edmund unlocked the door at the end of the East Corridor. He did not make a ceremony of it. He simply came to find Cecily in the library where she was reading the accounts of the Christmas period household expenditure with a cup of tea and a small degree of professional satisfaction. And he said, "Will you come?" And she set down the accounts and came. The room was a sitting room that had been his mother's. A woman who had died when he was 15 and whom he had, in the ordinary way of 15-year-old boys who loved their mothers, and found loss impossible to manage, placed so entirely beyond reach in his own mind that the room she had used had become a locked door in the east corridor, and something he could no longer enter. It was a comfortable, ordinary room, well maintained by Mrs. Farren's care, with a small upholstered sofa and 2 chairs and a writing desk and a portrait. The portrait was a double portrait, a young woman with a composed and intelligent face, and beside her a small boy of perhaps 5 or 6 with dark hair and the early version of the controlled, watchful look that Cecily had been reading for 4 weeks. "Your mother," she said. "Yes, and you. And me." She looked at the portrait for some time. She looked at the small boy's face and at the young mother's, and she said eventually, "She looks as though she found things very interesting." "She did," he said. She was very interested in everything. She read a great deal. She was not very easily impressed." He paused. "You would have suited one another, I think." "I think we might," said Cecily. She was standing beside him in front of the portrait, 6 inches away, which was, she noted, the closest they had physically been in 4 weeks of marriage. She did not move to close the distance, and neither did he. They stood side by side, looking at the portrait in the evening lamplight, and the house around them was quiet, and the December frost was at the windows, and there was between them something that was not yet any of the easy words one uses for such things, but that was present and warm and chosen. After some time he said, "I owe you an apology." "For what in particular?" "For treating distance as a kind of protection when it was not. For expecting you to live in a house full of locked doors and not ask about them, and for assuming that because I had decided not to look at certain things, you would also be content not to look at them. It was not fair. It was not kind." "No," said Cecily. "It was not. And in future I would prefer that you tell me things in what you consider good time, rather than in what circumstances compel. I am, as you may have gathered, rather difficult to surprise, and I do not require to be protected from difficult realities. I do, however, require to be spoken to honestly, and I shall in return speak to you honestly, and we shall see on that basis how we go on." He turned and looked at her. "Yes," he said, I should like that very much." He said it simply, in the plain, honest voice of a man who has been a long time arriving at something, and is, now that he has arrived, not inclined to qualify it. Cecily looked at him for some time. She looked at the face she had been reading for 4 weeks, which was still controlled, still watchful, but no longer closed. It was the face of a man who had, in the last fortnight, made a decision about how much of himself to make available to another person, and had landed, after some struggle, on most of it. "Good," she said. "Then we are agreed." The portrait of his mother and himself was carried back to the gallery 3 days into the new year, and rehung in its proper place between the 3rd Duchess and the summer landscape of the park. Margaret came to Ashenmere in April, for her first visit, and declared the Lime Tree Avenue nearly as good as the Dorset beach, and Mrs. Farren made a particular lemon cake for the occasion that was subsequently requested at every subsequent visit. Thomas recovered enough to travel by spring, and came for a fortnight in June, and sat in the garden with his brother and Cecily and Margaret on 3 fine afternoons in the long golden particular light of an English June, and said very little and was very content. Cecily, in April, moved the bulk of her work from the library to the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, which had better light in the mornings and a more comfortable chair, and where the portrait of the young woman with the composed and intelligent face kept her company through the long, quiet hours of the estate accounts. She was, in her private judgment, a year into a marriage that had been arranged for practical reasons, and that had become, through stubbornness and honesty, and several very cold dinner tables, something that required now a different word. She had not yet said the word to him. She intended to when she was certain he was ready to hear it. She was in general a patient woman. He came in one afternoon in April and found her at the writing desk in his mother's room, with a letter in one hand and the household accounts in the other, and the April light on her face, and Margaret's last drawing pinned to the corner of the letter stand. And he stood in the doorway for a long moment and looked at the room, and at the portrait, and at her, and thought that it was possible he was already ready, and had perhaps been ready for some time, and had been waiting only for the correct moment to say so. He was, at the best of times, too fond of waiting for correct moments. He came in from the doorway. He sat in the other chair. He said, "Cecily." She looked up, and he said what he said in the simple, honest voice of a man who has been a long time arriving at something, and is not, now that he has arrived, inclined to qualify it at all.